So let's begin. Probably people will be still joining in, but let's not waste time. So we're here today to discuss a few things about Angular. Actually, I'm going to focus about moving to Angular 2, which had its stable release about a month ago. Finally, after 2 years that we've known about the development itself was probably going on for even longer. But it's already released to the wild. We're free to use it. We're free to upgrade our projects to use the new version of the framework. So today I'm going to show you how you should approach this. I'm going to discuss if it's even worth doing it, depending on your situation, and what are your options for the future. So I'm Kuba Waliński. This is what I look like on the serious parts of the web. This is what I look like on the less serious parts of the web, like Twitter and stuff. You can email me if you wish. You can find me on Twitter. You can have a look at my GitHub account because this is where all the code and all the slides from my talks reside. The slides and code from this talk will also be there like during lunchtime today, probably. They'll be uploaded if you're interested. Two more things that you can see on this slide. First is DevDay, which is a conference in Krakow that took part in September this year. It's going to be another conference next year, so I warmly invite you. It used to be a .NET focused conference. Now it's more of a general programmers conference where we discuss many languages and paradigms. And lastly, I am a founding member and a CEO of Happy Team, which is a consulting company I started with a bunch of my friends. We used to work together in a team in a big corporation, but we got fed up with it. So we started our own company and started working on our own. And actually the first project that we tackled was an Angular 1 project that we started about a year ago in quite an uncomfortable situation because we already knew that Angular 2 is coming out, but it was way too early to try and use it. It was still very unstable. So we started the project knowing very well that at some point we'll have to migrate to Angular 2. I suppose many of you are in a similar situation and had to make similar decisions. And now finally is the time that we can figure out what are the next steps if you're stuck with an Angular 1 code base. So quite similarly to the keynote by John today, although I came with this idea separately, I would like to first start by telling you my adventures with Angular and how it all worked for me. As every JavaScript developer, I assume when they first see Angular, when they first see the two-way binding, everything happening automatically, we say, wow, magic. That's great. I've never seen JavaScript code that's so pleasurable to write at the beginning, that everything just works. Stuff's happening automatically for me. I don't have to do much to get stuff done. And then you dive in, you use Angular in your project, one project, then another project, a bigger project, and then you start seeing the problems, right? So it turns out that it's very easy to complicate this stuff. It's very easy to mix up stuff in the scope. Things are not working as you expected. Then suddenly you have to use scope applies everywhere so that everything just keeps working. And it becomes a pain if you're not careful. And for me personally, when I was in that phase of Angular is a bit complicated, then they announced Angular 2. It was about 2 years ago. And the first thing that they announced is that there's no backward compatibility. So they said, okay, so you have your Angular 1 code bases, but we don't care. Angular 2 is a completely new framework, and we're just going to do it from scratch, and we don't really care about you guys. You just have to rewrite your applications or just keep them in Angular 1 forever. And also they dropped one of my favorite features, which is two-way binding, which to my mind was the killer feature of Angular 1. Making sure that my view model and my view are always in sync automatically without having to lift a finger. So upon hearing those two things, I said, okay, I screw Angular 2, I don't really care. I'm going to stuck with Angular 1 for now because there's no real other options, although that's also about the time when React came about. But that's a completely different story. So I started looking into other options. One of the other promising options at the time was Aurelia, which is a framework that's very similar in its ideas to Angular, in no small part because it's created by Rob Eisenberg, who was the core member of the Angular team when they were working on 2.0. But then, due to some disagreements, also regarding the way that the upgrade path was planned, but not only that. So due to those disagreements, he left the Angular team and started working on Aurelia, and he actually managed to release Aurelia before Angular 2 was released. So that looked very promising, and that's why for a while I didn't really pay attention to what's happening with Angular 2. I just said, okay, screw it, I don't care. And then after realizing that actually rewriting the whole Angular 1 application that we've been working on for a year and a half to Aurelia is not really a pleasurable task and not something that I look forward to. I looked back at what's happening in the Angular camp. And then turns out that they did their homework. They went back to the drawing board due to the really bad reception of the announcement that there's no backward compatibility by the community. The community was really furious, so they actually changed their plans. And they introduced a migration path that's, to my mind, is one of the best I've seen ever in IT. Certainly in the world of JavaScript frameworks, which are very fragile and they tend to come and go, and nobody really cares. But they're now that they started to care. So today, with pleasure, I'm going to describe to you what are the migration options, because they are plenty, and there's a path, I'm sure, for everyone who's now stuck with an Angular 1 code base. But first, just so that we're all on the same page, there's a very brief introduction on the high level, a conceptual introduction to what are the differences between Angular 1 and Angular 2, mostly in terms of the elements that you can create in the framework. So in Angular 1, you had a lot of elements that you could create, starting from controllers, which manage some parts of your DOM. Then you could also have directives, but the directives can have different types. So the ones that you restrict to only be able to be used as an element, so you have restrict E. Those are called component directives, and they are basically not that different from a controller that just has its template, right? So because that's the component as well, the directive also has a template and its component, and that's why those two have been merged together in Angular 2 to simplify things, and they now form components. So there's no more standalone controllers in Angular 2. If you have those and you want to migrate, you will need to create components. Services, the deal is pretty simple. Although it's simplified in Angular 2, some of you might remember, some of you probably like me had endless discussions in the office about whether we should use services or factories or providers or values or whatever else in terms of Angular 1 services. So this complication was unnecessary, and they realized that. So there's just one way of defining services in Angular 2, and they directly correspond to the services that we have in Angular 1. Then we have decorator directives. So those are the directives that take a form of an attribute. So you restrict to A. And this is stuff that you usually don't write yourself. It's something most of the decorator directives are built-in ones, like ng-show, ng-height, ng-if, etc. So all the attributes that you can add to an HTML element that add some behavior to it. And those in Angular 2 are called directives, which is also, of course, a bit confusing, but what can you do? That's what they decided. And finally, we had filters in in Angular 1 just to format your output in the HTML. And you used pipe to apply the filter in the bindings, and so now they are called pipes because this name actually makes a bit more sense and it's more clearer. And a little spoiler is, looking at this chart, in terms of migration, if you're interested in migrating your current code, then you can migrate your controllers and component directives into Angular 2 components without problem. Services are basically the easiest part to migrate. They're almost one-to-one relation. And the other two, decorator directives and filters, there's no upgrade path, so you have to rewrite them. Fortunately, this is like the 1 or 2% of the Angular code base usually. So that's not that big a problem. And also in terms of filters, the implementation is very similar. So also rewriting this is not a big problem. So the big question, how to prepare right now? I know that Angular 2 is out. I know that at some point I might probably have to migrate. Maybe not all of my application. Maybe I'd like to start writing new code in Angular 2, keep the old one in Angular 1, because obviously the client or your boss will not be happy to pay money for no actual gain, just for rewriting stuff and not adding any new functionality. So if you have this plan to either migrate or have the two frameworks run side by side in your application, then basically what you have to do to prepare is to make your Angular 1 code look as if it was Angular 2. And there are a few steps that you can do to achieve that. So first of all, the advice that you'll read on any Google documentation or blog or training tutorial is to follow the style guide. And they mean the style guide that was created by John Papa, and it's available on GitHub. And it says, for example, single responsibility and the rule of one is one of the most important. And the rule of one means that for one file, you should have one Angular element in it. So one controller or one directive or one service. So you should definitely stay away from the default Angular project structure when Angular came out. Then there you had the directives file when all the directives were in there. You had the services file where all the services were in there. So this is not going to work for you because this is completely opposite to what we're aiming for in Angular 2. So you'll have the first step is you will have to separate those into, make sure everything is its own separate files. And the second step is to have a folders by feature structure. So again, coming back to this Angular template where you had directives, services, controllers, etc., all in one file. Ideally, a structure that you're looking for is more feature-oriented. So this is this actual project in Angular 1 that I'm working on. I'm going to zoom in here just to show you the folders. So this is basically what we're looking for. So this is an e-commerce type application. So as you'd expect, you have an orders folder, a products folder, some order details, messages that you can show to the user, etc. And inside, you have all the code that has to do with products. So you have controllers, you have the HTML, you have directives, etc. So everything is nicely structured. Every feature has its own folder. Why this is important? Because if you want to migrate feature by feature, then this separation will be really helpful because you know that you can migrate everything that's in the products controller without affecting any other features of your system, which will stay in Angular 1. Then it is strongly advised that you have a go at upgrading to the latest version of Angular. That's at the moment it's 1.58. It's very beneficial if you can upgrade to something in the 1.5 branch because they have added some features with migration in mind that will help you, which I'll speak about in a second. But if you're only interested in adding new stuff, for example, in Angular 2, and you don't really want to touch your existing code base because it's always a bit problematic, So sometimes you might stay on the cautious side and just leave the code as it is. If you're on 1.3 or 1.4, then it's good enough if you just want to run Angular 2 side by side with the old code. So it's not necessary, but it's really recommended for you to upgrade. And the upgrade to 1.5 is encouraged due to the new feature, which is components. So this was introduced to mimic the Angular 2 component. So it's just a way for you to specify the directives that mimic an element. So directive restrict E, the ones that have a template and a controller themselves. And instead of saying angular.directive, etc., I can say angular.controller, and you have some defaults in there. So you don't have to specify that it's an element directive because it's the only choice. You don't have to specify that the controller is using the controller REST syntax, etc. Although, to be honest with you, this is just some syntactic sugar, and it's not that useful. Because if you know that you're going to migrate this to Angular 2 eventually, you can leave this step and just do this work at the point of migration to Angular 2. If you know that you don't want to migrate this code to Angular 2, why bother updating it, right? It's working, so let's leave it until it dies in the form of Angular 1. So step 3 is not really that strong. That's why I recommend step 3a. What you have to do with your directives is you have to make sure you don't have those four features in them if you want to migrate them to Angular 2, because those features are not present in Angular 2. So you're going to have a bad time migrating. Of those, I think the most common one is replace, where it would just remove the tag that the directive is attached to from the HTML and replace it with the template. But it's been deprecated in Angular 1 for some time now, so hopefully you're not using it anymore, because this direction is also not present in Angular 2. So at the very least, if you know that some of your directives will be migrated, just make sure that those four things are not in there, and you don't have to go through this effort of switching to 1.5 components. Step 4. We'll need to switch to manual bootstrapping or bootstrapping in code. What I mean actually is every Angular application that you see ever, when you look into the index HTML, you see this, right? This tells us that from this node forward, this is going to be an Angular application, and its name is sflight in this instance. But if you're going to run Angular 1 and 2 side by side, this is not going to work for you, because you have to do the bootstrapping manually in order for the framework to be able to run two versions. And while you're still only doing Angular 1, this is how you do it. So somewhere in the code, after the DOM has loaded, you say angular.bootstrap, you specify the element which is the root of your application, and you specify the name of the application. So nothing critical there. I don't imagine that it will be a breaking change for anyone. Finally, my favorite part is that the Angular 2, as you know, or maybe don't know yet, but now you will know that by default it uses TypeScript. But it also has versions for ES6, ES5. But truth be told, TypeScript is the one that is the most supported. It's the one that you'll see all the documentation by default in. All the blog posts will present to you the code in TypeScript. So it's best to stick to TypeScript, or at least ECMAScript 6. But the TypeScript makes it a bit easier with annotations and a bit more readable. So once you switch your code to ECMAScript 6, there's usually not much that you have to do in terms of modifying the code, because ECMAScript 5 code is valid ECMAScript 6 code, and it's also valid TypeScript. So it's just a matter of introducing a build step so that your code is compiled, and using a module loader. Because in Angular 1, usually what we did is we had to list in the index.html all the scripts that are part of our Angular application, right? So you're adding a new feature, and you have to modify index.html to add all the new JavaScript files that hold the feature. So this is something that we've moved away from in Angular 2. And right now we're using the ECMAScript 6 modules for that. So we're in every file, we're defining what is exported out of this file, and then we can import this later on in other files. I'll show you in a moment how that works in my application. But first I'm going to show you a few of my favorite features from ECMAScript 6, because even if you're not upgrading to Angular 2, even if you're not interested, even if you're not writing Angular at all, I'm going to argue that you should definitely upgrade or start writing JavaScript in the ECMAScript 6 flavor sooner than later, because it's really a much better and a much more useful language for the developer. So my favorite features are arrow functions. Arrow functions, as you know them from C# as well, where we call them lambdas. So instead of specifying a function in a long form like that, you can specify it like that. Argument here and the return value after the arrow. Nothing revolutionary, right? Simple stuff. But what arrow functions are doing is they are solving the biggest problem with JavaScript that's been plaguing the web developers for years, and it's the problems with this. So you're coding your JavaScript, everything's going fine, then you're passing a callback to a for each function, and you want to reference the name that you have on this object here, and you get type error, cannot read property name of undefined, implicating that this is undefined for some reason. Unless you're very fluent in JavaScript, at the beginning you have no idea what's going on, right? But it turns out that if you pass a function like this to a callback, the reference to this is actually lost, and this is undefined. So what you had to do up till now is save this reference in the variable usually called self or dat or this too. I've seen different names. And then once you save that, before entering this anonymous function, you can reference it here, and then it will work for you as expected, right? But this is really weird, because the language, you intuitively feel that the language should not behave like that. And it finally does not behave like that, because when you use arrow functions, all this nonsense goes away, and this just points to the same this, so it basically points to the properties of this object. So it's very useful. Hopefully, once everyone adopts ECMAScript 6 and gets comfortable with arrow functions, people will no longer have to care about problems with this. A few less spectacular features, very useful in Angular though, especially in Angular 2, string manipulation. So you have this new way of defining strings. This is called the backtick element. So it's the one that's on your tilde key. So it's just like a bit of an inverted apostrophe. And when you use that, you have special type of string in Angular. And in there you can have special characters like tabs. It can be multi-line, which you'll see it's used a lot in Angular 2, because people tend to specify templates in line in their component files, which are JavaScript files, and they'll specify their HTML inside the JavaScript file, but to make it look a bit better, they'll format it into multiple line, exactly by using this feature. Finally, you can put templates into the string, and the variables will be substituted automatically for you if you use the $curly brace feature. And the $curly brace feature can also hold a bit of a more complicated expression, as you can see, not just a simple variable name. Destructuring, so something that we've also seen on the keynote this morning, and JavaScript has it as well. Very similar approach, although not tuples, but you can also destructure an array here. You can destructure an object, and you can even rename the variable. So as you can see, here we have a property called z, but in here we define that we actually want to put it into a variable called surprise. and then you can see that surprise is actually locked. Finally, one useful example of why you might be interested in this feature. Suppose you have an API or a service that returns a person to you. A person has a lot of different attributes inside, but you're only interested in the name of this person. So you can specify it right away, being explicit about your code. So anyone that reads your code, and you, when you come back after a few months to maintain the code, you see that you're calling the person, but you're only actually interested in the name. So you know that you can ignore all the other parameters. So it's very useful from the point of view of readability and maintainability of your code. And finally, you can do the same when you're passing stuff to a function. You can rename the variables that come in as property objects. Some more syntactic sugar. You have default values, which is also not news to us C# and .NET guys, but you have the default values that can depend on one another, which is quite crazy. I've not seen it put to good use yet, but it's a feature that you have there. So you can like say that Z is twice what you put in Y. And then you see if you put 8 in Y, you have 16. If you don't put anything in Y, that is 2 times 12, meaning 24. A bit more useful to my mind is that you can actually capture all the parameters that are passed to a function. So in this case, the first one will be put in X, and all the other ones will be put into Y as an array. And as you can see, we pass hello and true, and the hello and true are put into an array when we console log this. And it also works the other way around, this 3-dot operator, because you can, if you have an array, you can spread it. That's called the spread operator in this instance. So you have a function that accepts a list of arguments, but you have them in an array, so no problem, you just spread them and you convert the array to a list. And finally, there is also a solution for the second biggest reason for facepalms in JavaScript. And to my mind, the second biggest problem is the scope of your variables, because all normal programming languages use the scope that's denoted by the curly braces in your code, right? But JavaScript is not normal, so it uses function scope. So let me explain. All this code is one function. So that means that wherever in this function you have a declaration for var y, actually the y is available throughout the whole function. It disregards those curly braces here and those curly braces here. So you can see that you can do crazy stuff like define var here, but also already assigned to it before it's even defined. That's actually happening because JavaScript by default, without you realizing, moves all the variable declarations to the very top of the function. That's why they're available in the whole body of a function. But it's very confusing to every developer who's not been that much experience in JavaScript. So to solve this, we have two new keywords, let and const. And let for variables, const for constants, as you might assume. And it basically, those variables and constants have the same scope as stuff in C# or any other regular language. So you can see, because I defined x here, it's not available before, and it will throw an error. And it's also not available here because this is where the scope of x has ended with this curly brace. And the same with z, that is a constant. It's only available inside those curly braces. So again, a bit more sanity in JavaScript. So due to all those features, I really recommend that even if not for the sake of upgrading to Angular, you switch to using ECMAScript 6 ASAP. And once you're doing ECMAScript 6, you can do another useful thing with your current Angular code. You can switch it to use classes. And for this, I'm going to take a seat and show you a bit more of my code. You want to use classes before, that's how all the stuff in Angular 2 is defined with classes, all your components and services. And if you do that now, you'll have an easier time migrating. So in my application, all the controllers have the form of classes. And I also told you that I will show you how the modules are working. So as you can see in this controller, I'm importing a mousetrap module. And at the end, you'll see that the controller itself is exported from this file. So the class has a constructor, and it takes the stuff that's inserted into it by dependency injection. But you soon run into a problem when you're minifying the code. Of course, those names will be changed. So the dependency injection framework will not know what sort of services you want to insert. So in order to conquer that, what we've done on each of our controller or service, you have to define a $inject property, and you pass in an array with strings that correspond to the names of the injected items. So it's similar to the standard Angular 1 way of dealing with that, where you would pass an array where first you define the string names and then you define the controller or service. But in here you're not able to do this when you switch to classes, so that's the way that you have to handle that. For each item that we define as a class, be it a controller or a service, we have an Angular name and an Angular type. This is our custom addition, not something that's defined by Angular itself. I'll show you in a moment why that is, because we have some clever code that automatically registers all those classes with Angular. And as I said, we're doing this with ECMAScript 6 modules. So we have this one file where we have only one controller, and we have to explicitly state that we're exporting this controller out of this file, so that somewhere else in the code, namely in the products module, somewhere else in the code, I can import this controller from this file. And this is the structure that we follow, that for each of those feature modules that we have a module file that gathers all the files that compose this feature and then exports them together from one file, just to make it a bit clearer. So those are all the components that compose our product feature. Finally, we have services, which are very straightforward to be changed into classes. You just need a constructor, and then you have methods that you want to expose. So this is a simple service that just wraps the HTTP service. And you see the same story here. We have the inject and the Angular name and Angular type, and we're exporting the service out of the file as the very last thing. We also went ahead of ourselves a bit, and we also converted our directives to classes, because that was a year and a half ago and we didn't yet know what's the migration path going to be. So just to be safe, we wanted to have classes everywhere, but turns out that it's not really necessary. So this is just showing this to you as a novelty. And finally, what I wanted to show you is this code that automatically registers all those items. So we have a registration function that takes, you see the ECMAScript 6 features here, because it will take an unlimited amount of parameters. It will shove them into an array. And then for each item in this array, it will try to figure out if this is actually a function, meaning that it is a class, because a class underneath is really just a function. And if it is a function, it will proceed to register it, which the code I will show to you in a moment. But you can also pass this module to register all the things at once. So then it figures out that it's a module if it has keys in it, and then tries to register all the contents of this module at once. And how it's actually happening is we have this function that takes your Angular app as a parameter, and then it takes also the function that you want to register and tries to figure out what's the type. So that's why we specify if it's a controller or a service. And if it detects that it's a directive, there's a special case, which I won't go into details. But if it turns out that it's a controller or a service, we just call Angular. This is a way of invoking a method that's either controller or service, because that's what's inside this variable. And we just pass the Angular name that we want to use for this item, and we pass this actual function. So with this piece of code, we don't have to, after adding a new feature, we don't have to manually register everything with Angular. The only thing we have to do, and this file grows a bit big, because in this file we just have to import it. And there's a lot of stuff being imported here, as you can see. And once it's imported, we pass the modules to the registrator here. And it, as you've seen, it accepts any number of parameters, so it's just a matter of adding another module at the very bottom of this invocation list. Okay, coming back to the presentation. With all those steps, there were 6 of them. We're now ready to migrate. We've polished the code of our Angular 1 application. We have classes. We are sticking to the style guide. We have ordered our repository so that we have only one item in one file, or the files are in subfolders as expected. And now, let me introduce you to ng upgrade, which is a tool written by the Angular team, especially to facilitate the migration process. And it allows you to run your Angular 1 application side by side with your new Angular 2 application. So you can pick and choose how you want to deal with the upgrade. Say you don't really care that much about upgrading your old Angular 1 code, you can leave it as is, start new development in Angular 2. You can decide that actually services are easy to migrate, so why not do it? So you can only upgrade all your services. You can upgrade your products, feature, and leave orders in Angular 1. Basically, there's no end to the combinations that you can do. All depends on the decision of your team, of your product stakeholders. You can vary what is the risk in migrating, what's the risk in not migrating. Of course, to my mind, the biggest risk in not migrating that we're not always taking into consideration, because people say, why should I migrate? It will just work, right? It's working now. It won't stop working just because there's a new version. Obviously not. But I'm willing to bet big money on this, that in 2 years, you'll have a very hard time of finding a developer who will be willing to work on Angular 1. Right? So you either have to pay a lot of money to the people who are still dealing with Angular 1, or you just have to migrate in order to find people to work on your code. So how is this achieved, that you can have 2 versions of Angular running side by side? There are 3 things that the ng upgrade tool has to take care of. First one is dependency injection. So it makes it possible to reuse stuff from one framework in another framework. So if you have an Angular 1 service or component, you can upgrade it and have it used by Angular 2. And the other way around as well. If you have Angular 2 code, you can downgrade it and use it in Angular 1. So that's what enables the scenario, for example, where you want to change all your services to Angular 2 and then use them in Angular 1 without any problem. Then you have to do some clever stuff with the DOM, because you'll have some templates and some elements in the DOM that are controlled by Angular 1 and others that are controlled by Angular 2. And the ng upgrade also takes care of that. The one important thing to notice is that the root of this hybrid application is always Angular 1. So it's basically always an Angular 1 application that's also hosting an Angular 2 on the side. And finally, there's also the problem with change detection, because if we update a variable in Angular 1, obviously we want Angular 2 to know about it and react and change if necessary, and the other way around as well. So what happens is the whole change detection mechanism is controlled primarily by Angular 2. Whenever a change is detected, it does what it needs to do, and then afterwards it calls the digest cycle in Angular 1. They say, obviously you can realize that there's additional overhead here, and I assume that there is. I've not seen any real performance tests yet, but I assume that it's going to add some overhead to your application. That's why some people don't recommend using this mode on production, although I would wait with some definitive answers until we see some real performance numbers. Okay, and now finally let's look at some code. You remember one of the steps to prepare to migrate was to bootstrap manually, and this was done so that we can easily now change the standard Angular bootstrapper into the bootstrapper that's found in the Angular upgrade module. So that's the only thing that changes, that you call the bootstrap not on the Angular module but on the upgrade module. And you're good to go. And now you're running a hybrid application. And I'll show you very simple snippets of code to show you the 4 scenarios of downgrading services and components and upgrading services and components. So this is a component in Angular 2. It's a class that has some metadata attached to it to tell you what's the selector that it will use and what's the template. When you have a component like that, you can import it in your Angular 1 code, and using the upgrade adapter, you can call downgrade ng2 component and register it as a standard directive in Angular 1. And it all just magically works. So we're back to the magic of Angular again that it all started with. And you can also upgrade the component. So you can have a directive that's a component type directive because it's restricted to element and it has isolated scope. It has its own controller that's in form of a class. And there's no problem in bringing it into Angular 2 using upgrade ng1 component on this upgrade service. And it also works as simple as that. And finally, services. When you have an Angular 1 service that returns some data, you can register it in Angular 1, obviously, as ever. Then at some point you need to run it through an upgrade via the upgrader, upgrade ng1 provider. Once you do that, you can just use it here in the constructor for your component. This is TypeScript, so that's why you have types defined here after the colons. So don't be afraid. And as you can see, then you can just call the method on the Angular 1 service inside Angular 2 code. So it all just works. It's really beautiful and allows you to do crazy things. And the same way, it will work the other way around. So downgrading an Angular 2 service that looks like that, you can just register it here as a factory. So that's one thing that you have to remember. It's not as a service, but as a factory. And you just downgrade it, and you now have an Angular 1 service. So basically, what you need to decide now, if you're interested in this stuff, as I mentioned before, you have to pick your update strategy, discuss with your team, discuss with your product owners if it's worth upgrading the old code, if we should leave it, if it's worth the risk, because the risk, to my mind, is still unknown of running these 2 versions of Angular side by side in production. It's probably worth doing some performance tests on your actual application to see, just do the bootstrap, right? Just do the bare minimum, just do this, don't add any Angular 2 code yet, and perform some performance tests on your application and see if there are any downsides. And you can, as I said, you can do whatever you can basically think of in terms of deciding your update strategy and plotting your migration path. So here are some of the resources that I used. As I said, this code will land on my GitHub after lunch, and I'll also tweet it on my Twitter account if you're interested. So that's it for now. By this, luckily we finished earlier so we can eat before all the other ones finish. But first, if you have any questions, you can ask them now. If you're hungry, you can ask them later. There'll also be a Q&A session in the evening if you're interested. But any questions now? Yes? That was not a question. Okay. Okay. So we won't hold the room, so you can grab your lunch. And if you have any questions, just approach me now. We have some time we can discuss. Thanks very much.